One thing both sides in the independence debate agree on is that next year's referendum will be the biggest political decision Scotland has faced in more than 300 years. Much debate about Scotland in an independent Europe. An independent Scotland, I've been a member of the EU, should I say. Now, not everyone is convinced that that would be possible, but that's a whole different discussion. But for the purposes of this,
I think everybody is actually, nobody's saying that's not possible. Well, even the No campaign aren't saying that. They're accepting that Scotland would be a member. They just think it would be a difficult process. I don't think it would be a difficult process at all.
For the purposes of this, though, your point would be we could renegotiate a membership of the EU from within the EU. Do you think we would emerge from these negotiations with pretty much a status quo?
I think we'd certainly have the status quo in sterling. We wouldn't have to go into the euro. That's a nonsense argument. Even other countries, like Sweden, for example, haven't been forced into the euro. There's no desire.
The rebate, for example, the border
I think we'd have an excellent case to have at least as good a deal financially, if not better. And I'll tell you why. For example, Scotland is a country with its quite large territorial area, agricultural industry, should actually have hundreds of millions of pounds more coming from the EU in terms of agricultural support than we do at present moment as part of the UK. So I think we'll get as good a financial deal. I think the idea that we'd be forced into Schengen is total nonsense, and the proponents of that know it. And there's evidence, overwhelming evidence from other countries that nobody's going to be forced into the euro. We'll have the option.
But none of this is known. Nobody can be certain in any of these facts.
Yes, but there's no certainties on the UK's position. I mean, this debate has totally changed in the last week. The Prime Minister saying he's going to negotiate and perhaps, well, certainly have an in-out referendum, and therefore has opened the possibility of the UK walking out of the European Union. So all of the messages of the No campaign about uncertainty with independence and certainty with the UK, it's all been turned on its head. You're far more likely to end up with a successful negotiation for people like ourselves, negotiating from within, wanting to stay in Europe, than a negotiation which wants to turn Europe on its head and says we might walk out at the end of the day. So all the uncertainty now lies in the Westminster side. But
the Prime Minister of the UK has said that if he gets a renegotiated settlement, he will offer that as a referendum to the people of the UK. Francis asks, if we become independent, do we get a referendum for being in the EU?
No, we're negotiating to stay in the European Union, and we believe these negotiations will be successful.
But it might not be exactly the same, so is that worth having a referendum on?
We're confident we'll get at least as good terms, if not better terms, as Scotland as an independent country. Then we have the independence elections in 2016. Now, if other parties, the Conservatives, for example, so Eurosceptic, if they want to say, look, we want to go out of the European Union, they'd have the opportunity to do that in the Scottish elections, just as David Cameron is going to do it in the 2015 UK elections. So we're not stopping anybody having that choice, but we think the vast majority of Scots want to stay in the European Union, but want to represent ourselves. So like other countries, we can get a better deal. Name me a country, a small independent country in Europe, who would say, look, I don't want to be independent anymore. I'll let, if it's Denmark, I'll let Germany do the negotiations for me. The idea that Ireland would let the UK do its negotiations is total nonsense. You negotiate for yourselves, represented at the top table, to defend your own interests, and that's what Scotland
But our status could change. Is that not the issue?
Well, the status is going to change from being a subsidiary part of the UK as a member state who doesn't quite know in terms of the present government whether it wants to be in or out of Europe, to an independent country enthusiastic about Europe, looking for reform from within Europe, looking for allies, and looking to secure the best deal for Scotland. Take just one industry, for example. Way back when, in the 1970s, when the UK joined, a civil servant described them, that was the Scottish fishing industry, as, quote, expendable in the light of Britain's other European interests. For Scotland, an industry like fishing would never be expendable. It would always be at the top of our negotiating strategy.
What about that principle, though? Some people might ask, what's the point of becoming independent of the UK, only then to be subject to directives from the EU?
Well, I think the simplest way to look at it is control of taxation. Currently, under the devolved settlement, we control roughly 15%, only 15% of what Scotland earns. We only control 15% of the Scottish Parliament. It's going up to 20%. If we were an independent country in Europe, we'd control 99% of Scotland's revenue, everything except the VAT contribution. Now, it seems to me 99% control of revenue is independence, 20% control is still being run from London to spend them. And in terms of the European Union, far better to be at the top table defending Scotland's interests than to be an afterthought of a London government which doesn't even know whether it wants to be in the club in the first place. I think that's pretty clear.
Let me take you to what I call the Yugoslav question.
Right.
When Yugoslavia broke up, each of its constituent parts had to ask to come into Europe. Now, they weren't in Europe already.
Yeah, well,
and that is different, but nevertheless, and I'm not going over the controversy of whether you did or you didn't ask for advice as to whether it was required or not, but we don't know what the specific answer is, do we, as to whether you would have to reapply?
Well, the position about being in Europe for 40 years is rather important, John. There's several aspects, and several aspects of argument, but several aspects I think can be put beyond argument. We've been part of the European Union for 40 years. We are European citizens, as well as citizens of the United Kingdom, as well as Scots. The idea you can be deprived of that European citizenship is nonsensical. And I'll go further. Nobody actually seriously believes that Scotland wouldn't be part of the European Union. Nobody actually seriously believes in logic that the European Union is going to turn its back on the part of the Union with about 80% of its oil and gas reserves,
no, but you
with
know
about
better than
25%
anybody
of
that
renewable energy reserves.
The negotiations about the detail of what that relationship actually is
Can I offer you another thought, which would be surprising, not to you, but to some people in London? If the argument is that Scotland loses its European entitlement because the United Kingdom, which signed the treaties, no longer exists, then that argument applies to both parts of that United Kingdom. Because the United Kingdom was formed by the international treaty that allied Scotland and England. If that treaty is dissolved, as it would have to be by agreement post the Edinburgh Agreement, it's not a secession we're talking about, it's an agreement that's been enshrined in the Edinburgh Agreement that both sides will accept the result of the people. If that partnership is dissolved, as I think it should be in the benefit of our people, then both parties to that stand equal to each other and equal to any other relationships that they have. So those people who actually are arguing for their own purposes, and this is just a game.
No,
at
I
the
think you're
present
describing
moment.
a pretty gloomy situation
No,
in which you suddenly have both parts of Britain having to renegotiate their relationship with Europe.
But that is not the position of people who are arguing that Scotland will be excluded. They're arguing that Scotland will be excluded, but of course the rest of the United Kingdom will be unaffected. And that is a nonsensical position, and therefore the reality is that both parts of what was the United Kingdom will be within the European Union. They'll have to negotiate their position, certainly, but they'll negotiate the context from within the structures of the European Union, and that will be the practical answer to it. Of the 27 countries that currently make up the European Union, 6 of them did not exist as independent states before 1990. In that context, and looked in that way, Scotland's current constitutional status seems more and more like an anachronism. An independence which carries the right to participate as an equal on the international stage, appears more and more like Scotland's natural state of being. Independence, inevitably, in the modern world, goes hand in hand with interdependence. Our nationalism goes hand in hand with internationalism. Now, I want to say quite a bit more about the European Union, partly because it's an issue that's been discussed a lot in Scotland, and partly, of course, because it's important here in the United States. Any serious consideration of the history of Europe would recognise that in recent decades the European Union has been a force for good, a force for peace, prosperity and security. As the world's largest single market, European Union membership brings massive benefits and opportunities for Scotland. And despite all of the current difficulties in the Eurozone, we saw a reminder of that just 2 months ago with the announcement of the planned transatlantic trade and investment partnership between the European Union and the United States. Estimates show that once this is established, the European economy will have a stimulus of 0.5% of GDP. For Scotland, given that the United States is our largest individual trading partner outside the UK, this agreement will be especially good news. There is, however, a fundamental shortcoming in Scotland's current relationships with the European Union. On a range of issues, whether it be fishing or agriculture, employment, economic development, the Scottish Government currently has responsibility for policy making in Scotland, but we have no formal or direct representation when it comes to the decisions that are made in Brussels at the European Council. One advantage of independence, it would allow us to gain equal and full membership of the European Union, allowing us to cooperate on that basis of equality with 27 other member states, more than half of whom have a population of less than 10 million. Following a vote for independence in 2014, the Scottish Government would immediately make a notification of intent, confirming that as an independent nation we want to continue within the European Union. After all, Scotland would begin negotiations as a country which would be a net contributor to the EU budget and whose people are already European Union citizens. We would begin then as a country which already applies the body of law and policy of the European Union. And we begin as a country keen to be an equal and constructive partner in the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, Angus Roxburgh is a highly respected broadcaster and journalist who was the BBC's foremost European correspondent for many, many years. He summed up the position in an article last month, and I quote, "What would any country gain by making Scotland leave the European Union, wait a while and then rejoin? Out of sheer self-interest, every country would want to avoid such pointless disruption." His conclusion was also clear. Scotland's accession would almost certainly be the smoothest and quickest in European Union history. We anticipate negotiations. We'd signify our intent to remain a member of the European Union immediately following a yes vote in the referendum. That is in September of next year. Our target date for independence for Scotland is March 2016, which leaves a period of 18 months to successfully conclude these negotiations, along with other negotiations which will involve the United Kingdom government over a range of issues and other international organisations.